Hey, this is Jim Sharp. Welcome to the AZ Political Podcast. Headline number one this week, the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee presents a unified front as Democrats struggle to figure out what to do less than a month away from their convention. An Associated Press poll shows that nearly 2/3 of Democrats want President Joe Biden to drop out of the presidential race. And a polling memo that's been seen by Democratic Party officials argues their best chance to defeat Trump is with a new nominee, not even from this administration, as in not Kamala Harris. And apparently, U.S. Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona is one of those being seen as a top choice. And all of this happened before poor Joe Biden got COVID. Headline number two, Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff campaigns in Arizona as part of the Investing in America tour. Vice President Kamala Harris's husband speaks at a campaign event, followed by a discussion at an Arizona Black leadership panel. And headline number three, Special Counsel Jack Smith appealing a judge's decision to throw out the indictment against Donald Trump in his classified documents case just 2 days after U.S. District Judge Eileen Cannon dismissed the prosecution. And that brings me to my guest on the AZ Political Podcast, former Arizona Attorney General Mark Brnovich. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jim, for having me. And thank you for the soda.
No problem.
I appreciate that.
He claimed to not have his wallet with him. So, let's start off first with, can I call you Mark?
Yeah, just so we're clear, I'm a fiscal conservative, but I really did not have my wallet on me. I wasn't trying to shake you down, Jim, just so we're clear, okay?
Because, and the reason I ask if I can call you Mark is because there was a time a couple of years ago when you were still Attorney General, and I said, do I address you as General? And you said that would be really weird because you're also in the National Guard. But you're not a general in the National Guard, right?
Yeah, well, I made the joke is that, in fact, actually the colonel who was the state judge advocate when I was in the reserves, I used to have to call him colonel and salute him and stuff. And after I got elected, I jokingly used to say, well, I'm a general, so now you have to salute me. But yeah, I mean, look, I was never, and I think you know this about me, Jim, look, I grew up here. I'm a public school kid. I came to politics late. I mean, in the sense that I had never run for office before I was AG. And I know a lot of people really get hung up on that. Even people in our state legislature that want to be called, Senator so-and-so or Representative so-and-so. And the reality is that I think you have to respect the title. But yeah, call me Mark, call me Berno, whatever. Just don't call me late for dinner, right? Isn't that the Groucho Marx line?
Yeah, right. So let's talk about that documents case, because you were on Arizona's Morning News when that news came down that case was dismissed. Why did the judge dismiss the case in the first place? And does the special counsel have much of a chance of reviving the case? Because the judge's decision was really mostly about the special counsel, right?
Yeah, and so just to kind of unwrap it again, this all stems from the immunity case that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court,
right,
where the U.S. Supreme Court basically said when a president, when he or she is acting in their official capacity, they have immunity. That means they cannot be prosecuted, and those acts related to official actions can't even be used in another prosecution. So that, I think, created a lot of ripples in everything from the Georgia case to the New York case. And as part of that Supreme Court decision, Justice Thomas had written a concurrence. So he agreed with the majority as far as presidential immunity, but he also wrote that he believed that the whole way the special counsel was set up was unconstitutional.
Yeah.
And so, under Article 2, that's the executive branch of government. Article 1, not that everyone needs a lesson in the government class, but the president and the executive has certain powers, including, being the federal prosecutors. For years, for decades, conservatives have, complained about the special counsel laws, and they've always felt that they were constitutionally suspect. And so, when the law expired, there were people that had a real question of, well, wait a minute, how is someone who's not part officially of the executive branch allowed to prosecute a case? And so Clarence Thomas raised the issue. I think in a lot of ways it was, I don't want to say esoteric, but it was kind of one of those things that I think if a majority of the court believed that, he wouldn't have been the only one writing about it. That's why you do a concurrence or whatever.
Yeah.
So it will be interesting. I'm not sure if his colleagues in the Supreme Court, because bottom line is because of that, the judge in Florida used that as a basis, basically used the logic of Clarence Thomas saying that this person wasn't appointed properly under Article 2 of the Constitution. They weren't funded properly. So therefore it's unconstitutional. So she basically took Clarence Thomas's arguments and said, I agree with those. This is unconstitutional. Jack Smith will appeal because that's not what a majority said in the immunity case. And so, you're going to end up litigating this. I'm sure some of the justices on the Supreme Courts would rather not have to deal with this issue again or deal with it.
Right, yeah.
But the bottom line is, for political purposes, it's gosh, and I hate to use this expression, but I think the president, dodged another bullet, so to speak, because by the judge in Florida, by her dismissing that case, there is no way, even if Jack Smith appeals, that it'll ever be prosecuted, even if the Supreme Court says he can, for at least, another 6 months.
Yeah. And the immunity, of course, relates to the president acting in an official capacity. But is having those documents in his possession after he's in an official capacity as president, that wouldn't seem to be covered by the immunity.
Well, once again, there's a separate question.
And I know this has to do mostly with the special counsel. And
right, exactly.
That's a constitutional
the judge had dismissed the case based on the unconstitutionality of the appointment and funding of Jack Smith, essentially.
Right.
Now, the secondary question relates to, the Supreme Court issued this immunity decision. How does that impact what happened in Florida? I think the difficulty in appealing that is that a president does have the ability to unilaterally to declassify documents. And so, I think there's this open question of did President Trump declassify those documents or not declassify those documents? I actually thought myself, as a former prosecutor, and not commenting on the merits of it, but on the strength of the legal case, I actually thought the strongest case, and I, for example, I think the New York case is garbage. I mean, there's a statute of limitations issue. There's issues related to it's a federal crime, not a state crime. There's all sorts of issues with the testimony that was used. I mean, so the New York case will never be upheld on appeal. But I think that historically, when the DOJ goes after someone, the obstruction of justice or lying to the FBI are charges that are very frequently, they're very, very, very successful on. I mean, they really are. And so I think there was a question about, even assuming President Trump had declassified those documents when they were requested by the archives or the FBI, what was said to them, and did he deny having them, whether they were declassified or not. So, I mean, I think there was some real sticky legal issues there potentially for the president, but the reality is now we're not going to get to those issues, at least until next year sometime. And by that time, either President Trump will be president and he can dismiss this federal prosecutor or order his Department of Justice to not prosecute the case. Or he could reclassify the documents too, right? Yeah, I mean, no. There's a lot of things that happen. Look, I mean, this is the bottom line of this, Jim. This is why I think people don't like politics. I mean, why people are so tribal now? Because, look, assuming, okay, we know that those documents are there, whether they're declassified or not classified. So I think most people look at that and they say, wait a minute, Joe Biden had documents that were clearly classified that he couldn't. He was vice president or a senator. Yeah, and he couldn't declassify that were in his garage. And yet the DOJ and Jack Smith said, well, there's no reasonable likelihood of conviction for whatever reason. And we can get into mental acumen and everything else now that people are talking about. But they didn't prosecute Joe Biden for having those documents. And yet they're prosecuting former Trump for having them. And then if the logic is, well, it's an obstruction of justice because he didn't cooperate or turn the documents over when they were asked, then people say, well, wait a minute. When Hillary Clinton had computers, emails subpoenaed, she literally destroyed, talk about destruction of evidence or obstruction of justice, she destroyed her server, computer. And so, I think people look at that and they think, wait a minute, either you have equal justice under the law and you're going to prosecute people for having these documents, so why isn't Joe Biden being prosecuted? And if the other logic is like, well, we're not as concerned about whether the documents were declassified or not declassified, but we're worried more about the obstruction of justice, then the question becomes, well, under that standard, why wasn't Hillary Clinton prosecuted? And I think that's what bothers people, where it seems like no person is above the law, but no person is below the law. And it seems like if you're going to hold former President Trump to the standard, then you better hold every other elected official to that standard. Right.
Well, I hope you're at least partly wrong that this is why nobody likes politics, because this is the AZ Political Podcast, and you are
Well, they like you, though.
yeah, and you are a former politician, right? So,
former prosecutor, not a politician.
Okay, all right. Well, all right. You still got elected to political office, so we can split hairs later. But
twice statewide, just so we're clear.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
For the record, yes.
And as you've watched the Republican National Convention, I've kind of asked. I got to ask, what's been your emotional reaction? I know a lot of Republicans were really mad at you when you were unable to find any large-scale fraud that took place in the Arizona 2020 presidential election. Do you feel like a black sheep, or do you feel connected to everybody at the RNC?
I don't know. I mean, I think you'd have to ask other people that question. All I know is this: I've been the same person I've always been, and the irony is that look, I mean, there's a case called Brnovich v. DNC, literally named after me, because I went into federal court, went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and successfully argued that states have the ability to enact common sense election integrity measures, including restrictions on ballot harvesting and, including restrictions on out of precinct voting, something that conservatives have wanted for a long time. As a result of that decision, you saw states all over the country enacting more election integrity measures, including limitations on ballot harvesting. And so I would argue, I mean, maybe I sound like a lawyer now, but no one did more for election integrity in this country in the last decade than I have.
Right.
I mean, for the first time in Arizona's history, we had prosecuted people for illegally ballot harvesting. I said the most important case in a generation, which the left is upset about and still attacks me on, Brnovich v. DNC, I was able to successfully argue it. And I will say, just to drop something, that I was at a reception last year and a Supreme Court justice said that I must feel pretty special because I am one of the few people in the history of this country, maybe the only person, that's actually argued a case that's named after them and won that case. I mean, so as a lawyer, it's very rare, I mean, to have a case named after you, but to be able to argue it and then win it. And as I always add, but I am also the only guy that argued that case in Adidas High Top tennis shoes as well. So, I mean, I have that going for me. So look, I mean, I think people, if a certain narrative got created, and I mean, there's a lot of, and I'm always going off on tangents. This is like the Grateful Dead concert. Sorry about this. So, I think that when you're in office, and John McCain used to say, politics ain't beanbag, and a lot of people take a lot of shots at you, and I get that. But I do think that if you look at certain candidates who are running again this cycle, their only mode is to attack and inflame people as much as possible.
Right.
And so, when you have a candidate that's backed by somebody out of state that's literally spending $12 million attacking me, setting a narrative, I've always been outspent in races. I mean, that never bothered me. I was never a money guy, except I'm a middle class kid. But when you have all that kind of money, you're able to set a certain narrative. And so I think a narrative was set. And, as my mom says, or used to say, that, once you get a reputation as an early riser, you can wake up at 11 every morning and no one will notice. I mean, so someone sets a narrative. That's what people do in politics, left and right. And so I think unfairly a narrative is set, because if you flip it, like I said, you not only have Brnovich v. DNC, our office was able to point out deficiencies and problems in the election system. And as I said, and I've said before, I said it again, incompetence isn't a crime. I mean, it's, and look, I've handled thousands of criminal cases during the course of my career. Personally, I've done everything from being involved in death penalty cases to, non-residential burglaries over the course of my career. And, I know that when you bring a case, it's not just knowing it. You have to be able to prove it. And ethically, as a prosecutor, can you prove it beyond a reasonable doubt? So you may think you know something, but what's going to withstand the scrutiny of a jury? What's going to withstand the scrutiny of a judge? What's going to withstand the scrutiny of a $1,000 an hour defense attorney? And as prosecutors, we don't throw stuff against the wall and see what sticks.
Right.
So anyway, so I know I went off. So on the one hand, I think that in some ways there was an unfair narrative that's set, that I think that, for whatever reason, once people think that, it's hard to shake it off. But I think on the other hand, as I've said to people all the time, look, I've never belonged to a country club in my life. I still don't. Heck, I don't even really golf. But I if you look at issues, the border, I mean, no one did more on the border than I did. I mean, once again, I literally argued at the U.S. Supreme Court against the Biden administration on the public charge rule, where they were trying to give benefits to people in the country illegally. I issued an opinion that was controversial. Some folks were saying that what was going on our southern border constituted an invasion. I filed the first AG lawsuit challenging the vaccine mandates, against the Biden administration, which a lot of your colleagues in the media said was a publicity stunt, whatever. But we were right on that. We were ultimately right on that. So if you look at what I've done over the course of my career, before I was elected to AG, when I was elected to AG, there's always been a consistent arc of a healthy distrust of government, a healthy distrust of concentration of power, and basically calling them as I see them. And the problem with that is that there's people on the left that are upset because maybe the border or whatever other issues I took on, and then there's people on the right that think I should have done more. And like I said, I just would beg to differ with them.
So what do you think, having grown up in Arizona, and being a Republican for as long as you've been a Republican, what do you think the future of the Republican Party in Arizona is if Donald Trump gets back into the White House? And what is the future of the Republican Party in Arizona if he doesn't?
I literally this morning, I was watching the news at home. I saw multiple commercials for various Democratic candidates running for office. In fact, people I didn't even know what congressional district they're even running in. I mean,
right.
And I thought to myself, I literally thought about this, is that growing up here, I don't ever remember ever seeing a commercial for a Democrat, yet multiple commercials for Democrats running for Congress.
Right.
I mean, you maybe saw a Dennis DeConcini ad, and he was the senator through '86, and maybe you saw some of those, but really this was a very conservative, very Republican state. So I think the dynamic has shifted. But as I've told people, Arizona is still a conservative state. It's just not a crazy state. And if you look at in Scottsdale,
there are people,
Valley,
by the way, outside of Arizona that would disagree with that statement.
Yeah, I think though that if you look, I mean, and I've talked about this, that I won twice statewide, being outfunded both times. In fact, I actually got more raw votes than Sinema did in that whatever the cycle she was up in, and so in 2018. So I think if you have candidates, I mean, there's a great, I want to call it a libertarian, kind of that Barry Goldwater tradition here. I think that still permeates, most people here. Of course, you're getting more people moving from California. I mean, every time there's a natural disaster there, people cash out and move here. And I would remind
I'm not sticking around for the pestilence, people.
Yeah,
I'm not here, right?
Well, I would remind the Californians that high taxes and lots of regulation don't work where you have an ocean. Ain't going to work in the desert. So please keep those big government ideas over there. Yeah. But no, so I think the dynamic and, has changed. I mean, it has definitely changed. It's different. And I mean, the fact that you have, a Democrat and an independent who caucuses with the Democrats as our two senators is like kind of crazy. Yeah. I mean, and the fact that you have, if you look, Democratic governor, they ran the table, right, in 2022.
But wasn't that a result of Arizona being crazy Republican?
I think it's a result of the fact that candidates matter. And what history has shown here, even in recent history, is if you have candidates who are conservative, but if they can get up, articulate, and defend, free market, libertarian, rule of law values, they can win. And so I think the candidates do matter. And, the reality is, look, politics is about addition, not subtraction. And I don't want to throw shade on anyone that ran in the election cycle. As you mentioned, I'm not Mr. Popular, Mr. Congeniality in the Republican Party these days. But the reality is that it perplexes me. Look, when I was running, I'd say I'd take the endorsement. Anyone wants to endorse me, I'll take it. I mean, I think it was Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan that said, just because someone endorses me doesn't mean I endorse them. But, so I mean, so politics, Big Tent is about coalition, getting people to, to vote for you and, making the changes you need when you're in power. But I don't understand when you're running in a general election why you would attack even people within your own party, as some candidates did last time. I mean, it's a little perplexing to me, especially when you consider that, those people or the people being attacked were literally Republicans who had won statewide in multiple elections. And so, it just seems like the old adage that only a fool makes enemies unnecessarily. So I think that the candidate matters and that you can be a conservative, but, you can't be a phony and you can't be full of it. And you can't be insulting people in your own party.
Well, you mentioned Ronald Reagan. What was his commandment? Thou shalt not speak ill of another Republican?
Well,
right?
Well, no. In fact, I used to say this all the time when I was the Senate run, which was terrible. But but I would show up at an LD meeting or somewhere, and you'd have not only the other candidates running for Senate attacking me, you would have the person running for governor attacking me, the person running for AG attack. And I would be like, whoa, let's pump the brakes here. Once again, objectively, look at the issues, look at what our office did, look what I did. I would argue that even nationally, at the time, before I ran for the Senate, people said I was the most consequential AG in the country. I mean, when you look at issues from guns to border to Brnovich v. DNC, we were leading on all those issues nationwide. And I used to tell people that Ronald Reagan used to say, if someone agrees with you 7, 8 out of 10 times, they're not your enemy, they're your friend. And, that was one of Reagan's commandments. But I used to always add, the Brnovich caveat was, if someone agrees with you 10 out of 10 times, they ain't your friend, they're surely not your spouse, and they're definitely not your teenage daughters, but they're like a psychiatrist or a prostitute, because there's someone you're paying, because no one agrees with everyone 100% of the time. And so, this notion that you've got to have this political purity and you have to agree 100% on every single issue is just never existed. It's never even existed in humankind. Right. It doesn't exist even in family dynamics. It's not.
And do you think that that's what's at the heart of what's been really bothering a lot of Republicans? Is just like, wow. And that's actually, I worked in Republican politics, so I saw this from the inside. It's like there's a purity test that does not take place in the Democratic Party that takes place in the Republican Party. And I think it ends up defeating themselves a lot because of it.
I think you're right in the sense that it seems like the last decade or so, and it's been a while, that Republicans spend a lot of time attacking each other, and inevitably, nowadays, if someone disagrees with you on one issue, it's like you're a rhino, right? That's like the great,
right.
The problem is that if everyone's a rhino, then no one's a rhino, right? It's just like, and so every time someone disagrees with someone, and so even I sit there. Sometimes I was the other day or last week, there was a state senator who's in a fight with a state representative. They're all Republicans, and they accuse this person of that, and they were recording calls, and it's like it was all confusing to me, other than the fact that it's like, man, Republicans, we spend way too much time nitpicking and attacking each other instead of focusing on the big picture stuff. Mm. And I think that's why the Democrats were able to be successful this last election cycle.
I could keep you for forever. There's a lot of other stuff we could talk about, and I could get the full worth of that free Diet Coke you got over there.
I'll drink faster.
But I think the most important question in everybody's mind is Mark Brnovich still a deadhead? And if so, are you the only Republican who's a big fan of the Grateful Dead?
Yes, I'm still a deadhead. And here's the irony, Jim. I've actually...
You told me that, by the way, the first time I interviewed you.
I would tell you, there was... I don't know if this book's going to come out. I'm not trying to drop anything, but for Bob Weir's 70th birthday, someone had asked me to write a little bit about being a deadhead. And I did. And I don't know if they just gave it to him as a private book, but they had various people all over the country. And what I wrote about is that when I tell people I'm a deadhead and how much I love the Grateful Dead, a lot of times people are like, well, wait a minute, aren't you a Republican? Right. And they say you're a conservative Republican. Right. And I say, no. When you think about it, at the heart of what the Grateful Dead stood for is individually, we have a obligation to look after each other as a community, but it's a bottom up kind of thing. And the Grateful Dead distrusted authority. The Grateful Dead used to love go shooting guns. Bob Weir used to love cowboys and, wrote and sing cowboy songs. There was a very libertarian streak, even in the music, the way, it goes in different directions. And, one version of, whatever, Scarlet Begonias, Fire in the Mountain is going to be different from another version. And, you never knew what you were going to get because it could go and pop in all sorts of different directions. There's something very
free market music. It's what you're talking about.
It's very libertarian, very free. And even the fact that look at when the Dead it was counterintuitive, but even early on when they allow people recording, like every other artist was like, no, we need to make the profits. And the Dead is like, who cares? It's all going to work out. So people would be, trading and ripping concerts, and that ended up like increasing their popularity, And so anyway, I think a lot of things they did were very anti-authoritarian in a lot of ways. But they had this spirit of collective good. But it was something that you individually had an obligation to look after your fellow human being. The government shouldn't tell you what to do or not to do.
All right, that makes sense. Now the mystery of why Mark Brnovich, one of the top elected Republicans in the state of Arizona, is a big fan of the Grateful Dead. I like it. I will ask you this one more thing, though, real quickly. Let's talk about the change in gaming, because you were gaming director. You were here. You were working in government the whole time that we went through this whole transition into Arizona being a gaming state, and it's because of the tribes. It started off very rocky. Yeah,
it's actually fascinating to me as someone that even prosecuted gambling cases. Two largest gambling cases in Arizona history I prosecuted when I was at the federal government, federal prosecutor. It's fascinating how much it's changed, because as a society, if you look at, in the United States, I used to remind people that, the Revolutionary War was financed with lotteries. Ben Franklin ran the Pennsylvania lottery. And so we've had this love-hate relationship where there's times where, we've liked it, and then there's a lot of crime, a lot of corruption, a lot of social costs associated with it, and then there's a backlash and everyone hates it. And so we were in this phase in this country where, after the Wild West days and casinos, and then you had bordellos and drinking, and then, there was this backlash against it. So we didn't have gambling. No one wanted it. Even in Arizona, when the lottery passed, it passed by less than 1 percentage point. And there was all these allegations that it was going to lead to the downfall of, the family and Western civilization. And so when the tribes started, gaming on tribal lands, it was very controversial. Like I said, the government, the state tried to shut it down. There was lawsuits. Same thing happened in California, and these really nasty lawsuits. And, eventually, a gaming compact, Governor Hull was the governor. There was a gaming compact signed. And the notion was you'd have gaming that would be limited and well-regulated. That was kind of the theory. So you'd keep out crime, corruption, everything else. And, that was kind of the deal. And it was that way for a while. But people's attitudes, once again, have greatly changed. And so now you have full-blown casinos.
And you've got sports books.
You've got sports books, and, that we know historically. I mean, look, I'm very libertarian on this, is that I believe that, if you want to lose, or gambling is a very economically inefficient activity.
Yeah.
And if you want to give away your money, that's fine. But, there's people that, go spend $120 per seat at a Suns game or something. I mean, it's a form of entertainment, as long as you do that, understand that. But we also know that there is a certain percentage of people that will become addicted. There's always a social cost associated with it. And you mentioned sports gambling. I mean, sports gambling is really, really highly addictive. And I wonder what the consequences are going to be. Because your phone, I was going to pull my phone out as a prop here, but, I was at a Chick-fil-A a couple weeks ago. It was towards right when the playoffs started in the NBA. And I was in there, and there was these guys, I don't know, they looked probably like 20, like they were college students, looked like. And they were on their phones, and they were talking about like the over-under on a Boston Celtic game. And they were talking about like betting on this. And it's like so convenient and so easy. And I'm thinking, my gosh, like when you have grown up to that, you're exposed to that, and you can just like tap it.
Yeah.
And when internet gaming was, when I was gaming director, that was just kind of in its infancy. And there was a lot of people that were adamantly opposed to it. And they said, hey, it's one thing if you got to like literally physically drive, go to a casino, and there's a whole process. But, if you're sitting in your pajamas or in your parents' in your parents' basement, and dropping, $100, it's a whole different dynamic. And so the other thing, we've already seen this. We know that historically, you talk about corruption, is especially in sports gambling. We had this scandal here in the early 90s with Arizona State, where you had players shaving points. And so inevitably, especially when you have this much gambling and you have this many teams, you're going to end up with, players being corrupted, whether it's at the college level or even the pro level. There's all these stories now about baseball players and, whether they did or didn't bet on baseball games. And I'm sure Pete Rose is somewhere saying, gosh, I wish I had an interpreter. I could have blamed it on him, right? I mean, that's, I think that it's amazing to me how quickly, within a generation, attitudes change toward gambling. Like I said, when the lottery passed, less than a percentage point, highly controversial. And those are just like scratch tickets. We've gone from that in a generation to full-blown casinos and betting on your phone on Cardinals and Suns games.
Wow. Well, as a recovering alcoholic, there ain't no chance that we're going to go back to prohibition. So, I guess people can get addicted to anything, I guess.
That is true. But I think there's going to be social costs associated with it.
Yeah, no, there always is. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, appreciate it, General Brnovich.
No, come on now.
I'm Jim Sharp. Join me for the next AZ Political Podcast. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching the AZ Political Podcast with Jim Sharp. Click the box to watch more from KTAR News and tap the button in the middle to subscribe.